Okay, thank you. This is a bit of an experiment because I'm going to talk about something I haven't done before. So it might go right or it might go wrong. I have been asked to share a little of my own experience of psychiatry, and especially related to this project and this title here from which you can read. I have been talking much about myself during all these 25 years. I've been traveling around on conferences since 1991, almost every month. Been talking a lot about myself, but it's mostly then about madness, what madness really is and how to get out of it, and the other projects. And I don't going to do that now, but if you're interested, there is a new book published in England in some weeks where I have written a chapter. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the title of the book and the name of the publishers. But it's the first time you can read about my jungle model in English. It has only been printed in German before. If anybody is interested, I could find out the title. You can buy it cheaper before it's published if you pre-order it. I know, but I forgot even the name of the editors. So I can't give you much information about that. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a little about my own experience. Now it's quite a long ago, so I just say a little about the frame of it before. It's a very short. I have only 50 minutes, so I have to focus on a few things which are connected to the theme. But I have to give the frame of it first. And it was a long time ago. It was 1980 and 81. I was 2 years in a mental hospital in the old asylum system. I was one of the last one in Sweden who was in the old mental hospital when there was a little society of its own, which it's still institutions, but they are not in that way, not a society of its own anymore. When I was there, it was really sad. We had our own dentist, we had their own bank, our own hairdresser, we had everything. They grow their own vegetables. We have everything, like a little society outside. And that doesn't exist anymore. So I'm one of the few living witnesses of how it was from the inside. During these 2 years, the first 3 months I was on an ordinary ward in a general hospital. And I will go into talk most about that. Actually, it was much better when I moved out to the old asylum. It was much better than the modern hospital. Because of all this, I already said, we had this world, little society. We could play tennis, we could play football, we could do a lot of things. Instead of in a ward where you are very closed and you have just a little room to visit and walk around in the corridors. Anyway, I was there for these 2 years voluntarily, which sounds very strange to be 2 years voluntarily in a mental hospital when you really, from the very first days, notice that it doesn't work here at all. There are no professionals here. There are no professionalism. You are not going in the treatment. There are no treatment that are working. Anyway, and I asked the organizers here before that this fit into this context, being voluntary, not under forced psychiatric treatment, but I was under the very same regime. And I will tell you a little about how this worked in practice to be voluntary under a regime of forced treatment. First, I also want to tell you about my diagnosis, although I don't believe in diagnosis at all. So I had very severe, what is called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a wrong title also because it's not obsessive and it's not compulsory. It's actually a coping strategy, like all the others. Things that are developed by people with psychiatric problems. It's a strategy to cope with emotional problems, conflicts, and so on. It's not at all that you have a compulsion to do things, although it looks like that from the outside. And this is the reason why I was not compulsory treated, because this diagnosis you usually don't get forced treated, because you are seen as a rational being. And he also thought that people who met me in the hospital, they wouldn't see any different from now. When talking now, it was talking the same way like I do now. Even the visitors who came from outside, they often thought I was one of the staff. When they first met inside the door, they asked me if I was one of the nurses. So I wasn't there forced, but I was there voluntarily, and that was because my problems were so severe so I couldn't exist outside in society. I was studying at the university. I was even a student leader, and I lived in a student room in a corridor where we had to share bathrooms and a lot of things with a lot of other people. So it was impossible to stay there. I had to go to the hospital, to psychiatry. It was so severe. I tell you a little about the so-called symptoms. It was this, one side I had this washing, the cleaning, and it was severe. It could take me 8 to 10 hours. So it was really taking the whole day. It could take the whole day, just for one. Just take a shower could last. It didn't last before I went into the hospital, because it became much worse in the hospital. It was only a few hours, but in the hospital it developed into 10 hours. And it also had this other magical thinking that there's a symbol in everything, and if you do that, you could cause that, and if you avoid to do that, you could avoid causing that, and so on. And that was much more unseen. So the psychiatrists and the nurses, they didn't see this. They see the cleaning very well, because that was so obvious. So they really didn't know about anything, although I wanted to talk about it very much, but no, you are not offered any possibility to talk. They didn't want to listen to you at all. Although I was a voluntary patient, which means that I was not under the law of compulsory psychiatric treatment. I was on the general health law. We have the general health law, which says, in Sweden at least, it says that the doctor should inform you about the treatment, the consequences, the possible outcomes, the risks, and the doctor should also inform you about alternative treatments. That is one of the opening paragraphs in articles in the general health law. And I was under the general health law. They were very aware of it. They said, you are under the general health law. You're not under the psychiatric where you are, they don't have to fulfill all the requirements of the general health law. But that doesn't matter, because they didn't inform me of anything. They didn't discuss anything. They didn't even try to explain to me what my diagnosis was. They didn't discuss the medicines. They just gave them to me. They didn't even explain to me how the ward was organized. So I didn't even know what the staff was. I didn't know the hierarchy there with nurses and up to the psychiatrists. That's a lot of people, and after some week I figured out how it was socially constructed, the ward, but nobody told me. It was very easily, you could have done that immediately. Tell me, we are working here, and this is with this person. Just let you into a closed ward. The only difference for me, compared with the other patients, was that I could leave it immediately if I wanted. In any second. I don't even have to talk with the doctors. I could say, you go home now. I could go home. It was also that I could go out when I wanted. The doors were locked, but if I told a nurse that I wanted to go down to buy a newspaper, or I wanted to go home to my parents for some hours, they just had to open the door. And that was the only difference, actually. I don't even met most of my psychiatrists. They don't talk, and they didn't talk, and they didn't do it the same nowadays. Actually, psychiatry in Sweden is much worse today than it was 35 years ago. It was better then. It's much worse. They didn't at least beat patients, which you do down nowadays in Sweden. The person working there were quite friendly. Nice, but they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to support. They didn't know they had no help to offer. Just pills. And as most, okay, that is 5 minutes left there. Okay, so I had mostly no idea before about what psychiatry is before I entered there. I thought it was something completely else, something I've seen on American television show or something like that. You were lying on a bed talking with a doctor sitting in a chair beside you. But there was no one talking. I was so shocked about this. I was let into a ward, mostly elderly people, 75, dementia, people with dementia, 75 years old who was waiting to be replaced to a nursing home for elderly people. And I thought, when are they going to start with the treatment? Because nothing happened. I was just walking there, up and down, day and night, and I got these pills 3 times a day. The only thing that's happening. I just want to describe, because the minutes are running, one situation, and it happened after some weeks. They didn't talk to me at all about, as I said, I often stop the medication because it may make the side effects was so terrible. Not because I had any idea about medicines. I thought it was a stupid idea to give drugs. I have problem in my soul, in my psyche. I have not problems. Why should I have pills? It was, how could people be so stupid to think about this? But as you are suffering, you are trying everything. So of course I accepted it because I try everything who could relieve a little of your suffering. But it didn't help. It became just a lot of side effects. So I stopped it, and then they just put a new medicine, without asking me. So next day I got a new one, and it was the same problem with that. And I stopped it after a week, and then put a new one, another one, without having any discussion with me. Anyway, after some weeks, a morning, suddenly I found out that all bathrooms and all toilets in the whole ward were closed, locked. And I immediately understood that it was because of me. And there was a huge number of bathrooms. We had single rooms, and 2 rooms had one bathroom together, but not in the rooms, but outside, so it was open for everybody. So it was bathrooms and toilets everywhere. And it were actually 2 wards who was connected. So they locked all of them, which affected all the other patients who couldn't use them without asking the nurses to look up. And they had no discussion with me before about this. They had just this idea, they thought that now we have to stop him from washing, so we lock all of them. And in the evening I thought it was the most stupid. Now I have no one really who gave me any advice of what to do. There was nobody who knew anything about my problems. And I had only pills, which was not working anyway. I got neuroleptics, which nowadays are not used on OCD, because they are using antidepressants, but they didn't know in those days. I've actually written an article in another book called Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs, where I've written an article called Between Lobotomy and Antidepressant, because I was in the period when they have stopped using lobotomy and I haven't started with antidepressants. So it was really no reason to give neuroleptics at all, because they know they have no. Anyway, so when now they have locked the bathrooms and the toilets, I said, now why should I stay here? I said, no. So I said in the evening, I said, I will now go home. I pack all of my things. I go home now. And then the doctor wasn't there. The nurse became a bit worried and said, oh, why should you go home? Why should you go home? Now, couldn't you wait until the morning when the doctors came in so you could talk with the doctors? And then they started to tell me that if you go home, we won't let you back again. And I heard the same the next day from the doctor. If you go home, you are not allowed to come back. So they had me in that way. They had a hold on me. The pressure that it was not. I couldn't have any choice because, as I couldn't exist really outside, and I was allowed to go back. So I accepted. But they also opened all the bathrooms without asking me. Still, they have no discussion. So they just followed me. They thought they were a bit worried. So this doesn't work. So they opened all of them. So without any negotiation, without any discussing, I succeeded to get this, at least this little thing. in the way I wanted it. Yes, I know it's a 0, so I cannot tell the rest of the story. You have to listen to that another time. Okay, thank you.
I just want to say, yeah, we need to introduce you. So, thank you. Well, thanks, Matt. And I'm just going to, as briefly as I can, introduce the topic that we addressed in our paper on consent, because we were looking at what consent is really important, because when people are denied legal capacity, the right to consent is taken away. And I mean, this is really critical, especially for people in two particular areas that we looked at: the right to consent to sex and the right to consent to medical treatment. And you know, there are so many layers in which consenting to medical treatment is impacted by consent, and this is as we see from Matt's talk. But also, there are so many layers in which we look at consent and what it means for legal capacity. Its relationship with respecting people's right to be actors in their own right, and so. And consent is really important in law, and just to say this quickly, because what it does, people write about it as a moral magic, because it turns something that otherwise can be regarded as an assault or a crime. Consent is the moral magic that transforms an action by somebody into something that is legal, and that's why we're looking at it, and that's why we think it's really important to look at, well, how do we redefine what consent means, or to look at new ways to write about it in law, to be sure that we can answer the question, how is somebody giving free and informed consent, which makes something legally binding, without getting caught up in functional assessments of whether the person understands, which, you know, is where the risk with mental capacity assessment falls in. And as you will have heard from all the talks this morning, we are really keen to move away from the functional assessment of mental capacity. So, because obviously one of the core aspects of consent traditionally is looking at the free and informed part of it. So the informed part of it is tied to, currently in definitions, is tied to consent. So we try to look at some feminist scholarship around consent to sex, and to carry that over and say that we think that might work as regards consent to medical treatment. So we're taking the scholarship that moves beyond a simple yes-no models of consent to sex. So in a no means no model, you say, well, if the person says no, well then they're actually being, the sexual encounter is non-consensual, and therefore rape law can be applied. That is a huge problem, because many survivors report that they're actually frozen or not able to, because of the threat of the sexual assault that they're undergoing, that they're not even able to articulate no, and therefore rape laws are much more difficult, rape prosecutions are much more difficult to find, and so survivors are not covered by the no means no. And equally, yes means yes is slightly problematic in that it also leaves room for all of the patriarchal assumptions about you know, that women's role vis-a-vis men's advances and so on, and so that women's behaviour can be taken as an implied consent. And so we moved then to the idea of the freedom to negotiate standard, which was developed by Michelle Anderson. We're also looking at will and preference, and into substituting the idea of somebody having will and preference, which includes meaningful choices. And obviously, as Matt has explained, choices need to be meaningful. There need to be choices that make sense to people. So we're asking then, is there agreement and sufficient communication to determine whether consent is present or not? And then, really importantly, to respect refusals to consent, particularly refusals around medical treatment, most especially will and in psychiatry, as we've heard. it is a most coercive system that does not respect and in fact removes legal capacity for people to consent. So all of these are complex areas, and we're proposing, we've described them in our paper, so I invite you to look at the paper because it's really difficult in 15 minutes or less now to explain the complexity of marrying the two different proposals, freedom to consent onto medical treatment. So, okay, so the current position in law, we have this moral magic of consent being able to transform something that can otherwise be seen as an assault or an invasion of bodily integrity and prosecuted as a crime. So consent has that moral magic, and that's why we think it's really important to re-problematize it and to re-imagine how it could be constructed in a post-Article 12 world. Currently, there are lots of different tests for capacity to consent in different areas of law, and it applies to, as we heard this morning, laws around marriage, property, health, treatment, are all implicated in the idea that people have to be, a doctor needs to seek informed consent from people, free and informed consent, and likewise, a sexual encounter must have that negotiation between partners as equal, and to have a proper discussion about that's not the current situation. The current situation is that people are denied legal capacity, and so in terms of sex, at the moment people cannot consent to sex, they cannot even get married if they're denied legal capacity. So these are critical areas of law that we need to change. Obviously, the sex laws around rape really have patriarchal and ableist assumptions about people being available always to male pleasure, and we need to say that those are problems with the current situation. And obviously the biggest problem for us is the fact that mental capacity is currently a precondition for consent. And so people, when they're denied legal capacity, you have people making proxy decisions for them in terms of medical treatment, and obviously totally removing people's ability to consent or to engage in sexual activity, which has huge consequences for the people involved and also for the people who are engaging with people who are denied legal capacity in the sexual and intimate area of their lives. So for us, our proposal looks at key elements that need to be there when we're considering consent as a legal construct or a legal idea in the law. First of all, absolutely core is that people recognise universal legal capacity is core to it. Yes, we must have freedom to negotiate so that there is a proper and engaged communication, discussion between people, and that simple yes-no answers are not enough. We need to have a lot more space and for the nuances between the different aspects of the choices that need to be there. And so people have an opportunity to discuss, say, in healthcare, the potential benefits of a situation or potential benefits of health treatment and so on that don't currently pertain so particularly in terms of the power dynamics. So we would say that you can remove the emphasis on understanding if replace that with making sure that we are focusing on what it is the person wants, their will and preferences, to use that phrase that's really key to Article 12. And and then giving people meaningful choices, that there are plenty of options that they can choose from, and obviously reducing and minimising the things that normally are found to restrict consent, and to make it possible to argue or find in court that consent didn't exist in the situation of the relationship. The conditions that currently in law are found to minimise or to negate a question of consent or the presence of consent are coercion. I mean, if coercion is found to be present in a current contract or in a current relationship, it can be rendered null and void in a court. So coercion is a critical thing, and obviously it's hugely significant in in sexual encounters, and it is linked to the notion of to the finding of rape. But we also have coercion is really important, really significant, and really found in mental health environments. And so we say that consent can exist, true consent can exist when you have coercion. And coercion can include bullying, it can include threats, and we definitely have the threat of compulsory mental health treatment, and that's enshrined in law, so that it's a particular area of law that affects people with disabilities, and they're denied legal capacity by virtue of mental health laws if they're found to need compulsory treatment. And even in situations where somebody is voluntary, as Mats was describing, the same latent or hidden kind of coercive environment is still there, because people are aware, like something that you really need, the support can be taken away from you. People can be denied the right to the supports that they need if they don't go along with the doctors or the regimes or the systems ways of doing things. And so that is kind of also linked to power imbalances and also undue influence. All of these are elements. Undue influence is less, I suppose, dramatic. It's not quite a threat, it's more persuasive. But if somebody is, say in the case of a rape situation or an unwanted sexual encounter, somebody can go along with any situation if they're dependent on the person. And this is particularly key also with people with, who are living in institutions, or people who are dependent on a carer, that they must have the support, that they feel that they have to have that they can't stand up and say, no, that I don't want this. So therefore, consent in that instance is not necessarily genuine, valid consent. And likewise, and we probably haven't time to go into the nuances and all of the issues around domination and the power imbalances, but they're really clear in situations often, and it's a big part of feminist scholarship on sex and unwanted sexual encounters. But also, I can't say it goes without saying, but it is so critical in the doctor-patient relationship as well. So these, we would say, are things that have to be minimised, that they can't be present in order to have a genuine understanding of presence of consent. So in law, it can be argued the consent doesn't exist or is not valid when these conditions are very, very prominent. So to conclude what we're saying, I'm racing through because it's complex in time, but we're saying in our paper, which I really do invite people to read, is that we really must apply the freedom to negotiate idea, that it's not, move beyond simple yes, no, in order to determine if consent is present or absent. So people, in this scenario, people must sit and they must talk and they must have the freedom to negotiate. And that is going to have to include the supports that people are going to need. Say when we're talking about the supports that people need to exercise their legal capacity, they're going to need a lot. The supports must be available in order to make the options that people are asked to consent to meaningful. So we say we can move all of the feminist scholarship to consent to sex. We believe it will work when we kind of devise laws or propose ideas for law reform that relate to medical treatment as well, consenting to medical treatment. We say that if you apply the will and preference test, then it is not so important to go and seek and assess the level of understanding that somebody has. Because as Eleanor explained quite clearly this morning, there's a double standard when it comes to people with disabilities. It is only when legal capacity is in doubt and mental capacity is assessed that people fail these tests that are not, it's a double standard. It applies more particularly to people with to disabilities than to everyone else. So we're saying that if you spend enough time giving people the support they need to articulate, to communicate what it is that they want and their will and preferences, that can kind of alleviate some of the necessity to develop consent, understanding. So it's quite clear that coercion, undue influence and power imbalances affect presence of consent. And most importantly, and I'll leave it at this, that we feel we can avoid premising consent and tests of consent and whether consent is present in law. We avoid premising consent on functional tests of mental capacity or whether somebody understands, because there's, as I've said, we are arguing that double standard. So that's